Hello, everybody. I'm Skip Elsheimer. Welcome to the AV Geeks Lunchtime Streaming Show, where we watch old 16mm films. And I don't know why YouTube was like being a pain. It wasn't quite starting, and I was like, "What's going on?" And I was like running around trying to figure out. But then eventually it started up. So who knows? But that was. It said Korea at the beginning. I'm not quite sure. Then it says Chelonians, Pekin, Korea. It seemed to be a lot of China in there. So, anyways, that was from the Mogul Brothers collection, which you could rent back in the day or purchase from the Mogul Brothers library, which was based in New York City. And a bunch of these films ended up different places, including the Oregon Archive, where we scanned them on their behalf. Here's another film from that collection, Plant Growth. Enjoy.
Although we commonly consider the animal kingdom as of greater importance, it is well to remember that plants are the ultimate source of food for all forms of animal life. Like animals, plants need proper food and sufficient air and water in order to live and thrive. Here we shall see the life story of a typical plant condensed into a few minutes. Beauty is the principal appeal of flowers. Beauty of color, beauty of form, beauty of fragrance. Also, the flower has a most important and most interesting practical function. It is the forerunner of the seed, and it is by means of seeds that the flowering plants reproduce themselves. The seed of the pea plant germinates or starts to grow by sending a root downward into the soil and a stem upward into the air. With the time speeded up, we shall see the main or primary root branching and developing root hairs near the tips. The roots have two uses, namely to anchor and support the plant and to absorb water and other food from the soil. The latter is accomplished mainly by the root hairs. The stem pushes up through the soil in an arched or bent over position, thus protecting its first young leaves. The stem supports the leaves which need air and sunlight for their work. Oxygen of the air is used in breathing, and carbon dioxide is used in making starch for food. The stem of the pea plant, not being very rigid, depends upon its tendrils for support. The leaves are the breathing organs and also the food factories. The tendrils twine about the string and thus support the stem of the plant. In the picture, see them respond to the stimulus produced by the string. The growth on the inner side of the curve of the tendril seems to be checked by the contact with the string, and this causes it to twine around the support. Note how firmly the tendrils attach themselves to the support. They twine around and around until there is not the least danger of being pulled loose. The tendrils seem to seek a support, and in this apparent search, they seem to avoid each other. Note the swinging of the top of the plant with the tendrils. It seems as if under the control of a brain, as are the voluntary acts of animals. Nothing gives us so good a notion of opening flowers as the motion picture with the time speeded up by time-lapse photography. These remarkable nodding movements are due to the change of the rate of growth on the various sides. If one side grows faster for a time than the opposite, the stems lean away from the side growing most rapidly. It should be remembered that the time is greatly speeded up. In this close-up of the pea blossom, the lateral or side petals are drawn apart, exposing the boat-shaped keel, which is made up of two petals. The keel protects the essential parts of the flower, the stamens and the pistil. Now let me open a wing. Inside is a projection here, which fits into a groove here in the keel. top or outer tip of the pistil is called the stigma. The stalk of the stigma is called the style, and the lower part of the pistil is the ovary in which the seeds develop. The pistil may be called the female part of the flower. The stamens are the male part of the flower. It is in the pollen sacs or anthers of the stamens that the pollen grains develop. Bees, in their quest for nectar out of which to make honey, may brush the pollen grains from the stamens and carry them on their bodies to other flowers, and thus bring about cross-fertilization, which is so important in the life history of most of our flowering plants. The bee, in seeking nectar from the pea flower, accidentally or incidentally gets the pollen grains on its body, for the pollen grains are ripe and are being shed when the nectar is ready. Another view of a bee visiting a pea blossom. She is probably attracted by the bright color and by the fragrance of the flower. The bee's perception of color is probably not just like ours, and her sense of smell is probably much more acute. In visiting the next flower, it is very probable that some of the pollen grains carried by the bee will be brushed upon the stigma, and thus fertilization will be brought about. We could not photograph pollen tubes growing from the stigma down through the style, for the style is opaque. Hence, these germinating pollen grains were photographed in a clear solution, and they were photographed through a microscope. Note how each pollen grain puts out a long tube, which after many hours will reach the ovule. In the pollen tube, note the streaming of the protoplasm, which is the living substance of the plant. This is an unusual picture. After the male cell has moved out of the pollen tube and has united with the egg cell in the ovule, that is, after the egg cell has been fertilized, the ovule will develop into a seed. Here we see how ovules become seeds. The pollen grains which are carried to another flower and left upon the stigma will germinate and send tubes down through the style to the ovules or the beginnings of seeds in the ovary. The pollen tube will penetrate an ovule, and the male cell which came from the pollen grain will move out of the tip of the pollen tube and unite with the egg cell, and that union is fertilization. The egg cell, after fertilization, that is, after it has united with the male cell which came from the pollen grain, will develop into a tiny plant or embryo within the seed. After fertilization has occurred, the flower withers and the pods grow to accommodate the developing seeds within. The pod continues to develop until the seeds are ripe. The remains of the withered flower may be seen at the outer end. The ripe seeds are a resting stage in the life history of a plant. After the seeds are ripe, the pods burst open as shown here, and the parts of the pod curl up with such energy that the seeds are shot a considerable distance. This scattering of the seeds far and wide is a distinct advantage in wild plants, for in this way they establish themselves over greater areas. The germination of this seed on top of a rock shows the lack of suitable conditions. The proper requirements are sufficient moisture, but not too much, sufficient warmth, but not too much, and reasonably pulverized soil. Here we see the young plant die on account of improper conditions. Contrasted with the last, here is a seed germinating under ideal conditions. Note the root growing downward with secondary roots or branches growing out from the main or primary root. Note the root hairs, which are always a short distance back from the root tips. Note the stem growing upward, that is, in a direction opposite to that taken by the root. In this picture, we have examined the life story of the pea, and have followed it from one generation to the next. What we have
That just ended, and that happened a lot. These films, they were from an actual library of, even though it was a commercial library. So what happens is the beginnings and the ends sometimes get clipped off, and that's what happened with the films on our collection. It happens all the time. All right, so on the film scanner behind me, I got very excited about It's a Screen Printed World yesterday because of the bongos and the awesome soundtrack. This is not as exciting, but it's exciting for me because I'm a big fan of footage of printing in newspapers. Before I was really into collecting films, I was collecting printing presses, and photocopiers. So there you go. Anyways, this is Printing Through the Ages. Enjoy.
Make a print. We simply take a piece of wood or a block of linoleum or even half a potato. We cut away part of the flat surface so that we raise pattern. Then we dab the potato with heavy ink or paint. Next, we put the inked surface against a piece of paper and press hard. We have made a print, and we can make as many more as we like. One of the earliest ways of printing was by means of a seal, which was pressed onto soft clay or wax. People have used such seals for thousands of years. But it was a long time before anyone thought of putting ink onto a seal so that many prints could be made on paper or fabric. The first real printing from larger blocks started in China and Japan. Sometimes the Chinese and Japanese printed whole pictures from blocks of wood. Some of these prints found their way westward to Europe. Many hundreds of years later, people in Europe began to make prints for themselves. Here is a design being printed as a repeat pattern on a large piece of cloth. Another early method of printing, in this case, playing cards. To us, these methods seem crude, but they were the best of their day. The European printers found that they could get a firm and even pressure by using a press, like a wine press. Each turn of a screw above increased the pressure on a flat plate beneath. After a while, they began to print words in addition to pictures, and sometimes a whole page of words was cut in wood. But this was slow business, for each letter had to be cut anew each time it was used. Now, the 15th century in Europe, the time of many new ideas and inventions. People wanted to read about them, but still they could get only books copied slowly by hand. A new invention was greatly needed so that more books could be produced. Then, in a secret workshop in the town of Mainz in Germany, something startling was accomplished. A man named Gutenberg had managed to do something that had never been done before. After 20 years of experimenting, he had produced a fine and unusual book. Gutenberg had printed a magnificent Bible, but what was more important, he had printed not just one, but 200 Bibles, all exactly alike. This was unheard of. It meant that as many pages could now be printed in a day as a man could write by hand in a whole year. Well, what was Gutenberg's great invention that made this possible? Gutenberg had reasoned somewhat like this. We use the 26 letters of our alphabet over and over again as we write different words. Look at the letter E, for example. Now, if many copies of each letter could be made easily in separate pieces, they could be used again and again as often as needed. But to cut separate letters in wood was much too slow. So, if cast metal letters could be made, Gutenberg saw a way of greatly speeding up the printing process. So he got metal craftsmen to make letters. This is the letter S of that time. After the metal letter had been checked and hardened, the craftsman was ready to use it as a punch. He selected a softer piece of metal, and into it he hammered a deep impression of the letter. This impression became the exact reverse of the letter on the punch. This piece was called the matrix. It was really a deep print of the punch. This matrix was put into a mold. Metal was poured into this mold, running into all the crevices of the letter on the matrix. Here, in fact, was a piece of metal type. Dozens of separate metal letters could be made each day from each matrix, all exactly alike, and each could be used over and over again. So, the great invention Gutenberg had contributed to printing was movable metal type. At first, in Germany, the letters as they were written by hand became the models for the metal type to be used in printing. Then, exactly the same thing happened in Italy. Written letters became models for type letters. But soon in France, printers began to design letters specially for printing, which had become the accepted way of producing books. By the 15th century, printing presses had been set up over most of Europe, working the same way, but using printing types that varied a great deal. And shortly, newspapers were being started. But old presses were too slow to print newspapers. They still used essentially a central screw acting on a pressure plate beneath through the action of a lever. By this time, however, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Metal smelting was being developed. New machines were being made, all of metal. So the old wooden printing press was replaced by a cast iron press, which could do more work and do it more quickly. Other new ideas were invading the trade. Mechanical inking rollers were developed. These could spread the ink over the type quickly and evenly. They became part of the newer presses. The old hand ink pads gave way to mechanical rollers. The old-time screw and lever for applying pressure gave way to a revolving drum under which the type could be moved back and forth. The black roller gave it ink, and the paper passed between drum and type. Now one press could turn out 1,000 copies an hour. Developments followed one another quickly. More and more newspapers were called for. The London Times had been started in the 1780s. A new printing press, invented by Koenig, was installed by the Times in 1814. It turned out 1,100 prints an hour. In 1827, 5,000 prints an hour. By now, however, flatbed presses were too slow. Another invention speeded up printing, and this is the way it worked. The flat page of type was locked in place in the usual way and made flat and even all over. Layers of tissue and blotting paper, pasted together, were laid over the page. A deep impression of the page was made, just as the impression of a single letter had been made long before. The impressed paper matrix was then put into a casting machine, which shaped it like a half-cylinder. The molten metal poured around it thus had a half-cylinder shape. Two of these half-cylinders were then mounted around the drum of the press. This drawing shows what happened. Instead of being flat, the pages of metal now fitted around the drum. As the drum turned, the letters received ink, and the sheets of paper were printed on one side as they fed through. The paper-making industry in France next helped speed up printing. It brought out this machine, which made paper in one continuous roll instead of separate sheets, as had been done previously. With this paper roll available, here is what next happened to the newspaper press. A second printing drum, pressure cylinder, and set of ink rollers could be added. Now, both sides of a continuous sheet of paper could be printed in one operation. By this machine, newspapers could be printed twice as quickly as before. Just 100 years earlier, the printing press had been a simple, hand-operated contrivance. In 1 century, it had developed into a large and complicated machine. Through the years following, improvements came rapidly, and today the printing industry is highly organized, with scores of specialized jobs. Much of the work is done by machines. As this operator touches the keys, this machine molds each letter of type separately. It is called a monotype machine. And this is a linotype machine. Each line of type is molded in one long piece. In both machines, new type is molded for each job. Here's an interesting machine of the modern printing industry. It is putting together the sections of pages of a magazine in the right order for binding. And on this great press, 250,000 copies of tomorrow morning's newspaper are being printed with lightning speed. So, printing today is for everybody. Newspapers, books, magazines by the millions, well-designed and mass-produced. And we have all these today because, down through the ages, men and women in many parts of the world have ever been working to do a better job of printing.
It's the antithesis of what we just saw yesterday, as far as the jazzy, exciting 1960s soundtrack with percussion and this didn't have any music. All right, so what do we got? It's winter, right? It's winter. There was frost on my windshield this morning. It's winter, and I'm sure it's winter on the farm. Enjoy.
It is December, and the first winter snow has fallen during the night. Joan and Jerry Johnson are starting out to explore the new white blanket of snow. They leave their tracks everywhere they go. they notice that some small animal has left its tracks in the snow, too. Now, what animal could have made these tracks? They're still fresh. They were made only a short time ago. No. Jerry have frightened him, and away he goes. Joan and Jerry must be on their way, too. They are on their way out to the woods to cut a Christmas tree. First, they must stop to get the things they will need. For one thing, axe. And it's a good sharp axe. And next, a sled. A sled to haul the tree home from the woods. The snow is just right for a sled. And Joan wants to pull. So, away from the farmyard and out near the woods where the snow is a little deeper. Now what does Jerry see? Fresh track snow again. And here is the fox that made the tracks. The fox may know that there's someone near. His thick fur coat keeps him warm during the cold weather. Keep quiet, says Jerry. But the fox isn't sure it's safe here. And away he goes, galloping farther and farther through the trees. Now, Joan would like a ride. It's only a short way to where the evergreen trees grow. They stop at the edge of the woods because they see a young deer, a fawn. He's probably in the grass. The leaves are gone from trees and bushes. It's harder for deer to find food, and they often come up close to farmhouses. The fawn watches Joan and Jerry close. He's a little bit afraid of people. He'll feel safer back in the woods. Jerry knows just where there is a nice little Christmas tree. And Joan likes it very much. Joan thinks Jerry is a good woodsman. What a fine Christmas tree. Just the right size for the Johnson living room, and just the right size for the sled. Jerry has brought along a rope to hold the tree on the sled. Now, back through the pasture and onto the house with the tree for the happy Christmas holidays. Now it is January, and the snow is much deeper. Inside the house, it is warm and cozy. Joan watches Jerry as he shovels a path out to the barn. Shoveling snow is work that Jerry likes. Joan thinks the farm is very beautiful under its blanket of snow. Here comes Father. It's time for the morning chores. In winter, when snow covers the grass in the pasture, the Johnsons feed their livestock in the barn. This is the hay that Jerry and Mr. Johnson cut and put in the barn last summer. The horses stay inside the barn on cold winter days when they're not working. Another fork of hay will fill the manger. In another part of the barn, Father is feeding the milk cows. During the winter, the Johnsons keep the cows in the barn most of the time. The cows give more milk if they are kept warm and get the right kind of feed. Whiskers, the cat, has found a comfortable place for a nap. The feed Father brings in the big shovel is called silage. Last autumn, he made the silage by cutting up green corn and putting it in the silo. It's close to milking time, and that's the time for Whisker's breakfast. At the house, Joan is taking breakfast to the birds. This morning, she put sunflower seeds and nut meats into a feeding box for the birds that stay on the farm. On a tree nearby, there is a basket made of string where she puts suet for the birds. It is harder for them to find food when the ground is covered with snow. While Joan is waiting for her birds, she sees the long icicles that hang from the edge of the roof. Here comes a bird now. It's a chickadee. Chickadees stay on the Johnson farm all winter. They seem frisky and gay even in the cold weather, but they really need help in finding food during the winter. Now it is a day late in February. Jerry and Joan are coming home from school. It's goodbye to schoolmates until tomorrow. Up the road toward the house and close by the old snowdrift. This is the biggest snowdrift left along the road. But now it's melting fast. Some of the water soaks into the ground. It will water spring plants. Some of the water runs down the road to the river. At the edge of the snowdrift, the melting snow has uncovered a small green plant. It has stayed alive under the snow all winter. On the way to the house, Joan and Jerry start their evening chores. Their first job is to water the cows. Electricity that pumps water for the milk cows. Even in the winter, the Johnson cows come out of the barn for fresh water. Back of the barn is a spot that Joan and Jerry are watching carefully these days. It's a hole that leads to...
Where'd it go? I don't know. It's a hole that leads to darkness. As I said, unfortunately, these films sometimes they're missing the beginning and missing the end, and we've experienced that for the last couple of films. The Printing Throughout the Ages was missing its title. The Plant Growth was missing the end. And what happens? The reason why. Just as to kind of explain a little bit, is generally when films get beat up, it's at the beginning or the end, and it's because when someone is threading the projector, they might not do it right, and so it gets shredded. They stop it, gets returned to the library. Library is like, yeah, we can't salvage this. They clip it out. Sometimes, if they're resourceful, they will reorder footage if it's possible. The big educational film companies, you could do that. You could reorder. So that happens sometimes. We're watching a film, beautiful color, and then it goes to red because the footage was replaced. The other thing that happens is a teacher stops the projector at the end and then just rewinds it. So the film is going back through the gate to rewind. They don't know that they have to actually pull it out of the gate and rewind it. And so that, again, shreds the film. So that's how this happens, unfortunately. Here's another example on the scanner. I didn't know this is a recent arrival. We don't have a copy of this, and I'm desperately hoping to find a better copy of this. But it's missing the beginning. It's called Mathematical Peep Show. It was made by the Eames, who you might remember from just based on Tops, Information Machine, and then of course Powers of 10 was a popular film. And also lots of furniture. They made lots of mid-century modern furniture. So this is something they did called Mathematical Peep Show. Enjoy.
You set about to measure the Earth with the mathematical knowledge and tools you already possess. A Greek named Eratosthenes did it 240 years before Christ. He was head of the great library of Alexandria in Egypt, a city built by the Greeks. He, like others, suspected that the world was round. After all, the sun and the moon were round. He had also noticed that the sun's rays fell in parallel lines. Greeks before him had divided the circle into degrees and had measured angles. With this information and a logical mind, he measured the Earth. Here is how. While visiting the city of Syene one midsummer's day, Eratosthenes noticed that the reflection of the sun could be seen in the bottom of a deep well. The sun was overhead, and the rays pointed to the center of the Earth. He remembered this, and on the next midsummer's day in Alexandria, he measured the shadow cast by an obelisk. Sunbeams travel in parallel lines, so the difference in angle had to result from the curvature of the Earth. If the angle was 1/50th of a circle, then the distance around the world must be 50 times the distance from Alexandria to Syene. With these simple tools, Eratosthenes made this almost exact measurement of the world more than 1,700 years before Magellan sailed around it. He was a friend of Archimedes, mathematician and a poet, for finding prime numbers, geographer, and corrected the calendar one we use today.
About the turn of the century, the French mathematician Marie-Camille Jordan stated, "A simple closed curve in the plane divides the plane into exactly two domains. If we ask a young child to copy these forms, he is apt to produce a series of related blobs. And when he does, he is unconsciously recognizing the fundamental similarity between these shapes. Each one divides the paper into an inside part and an outside part. A point that lies in one area cannot get to the other, no matter how the curve is stretched. It is a simple closed curve, which means that it does not cross itself, and it ends at its beginning point. If it follows these rules, it will behave the same regardless of how it is distorted. Now it would be more difficult to tell if any given point lies inside the curve or outside. But there is a way. If a line is drawn from that point to the area beyond, and it crosses the curve an odd number of times, we find that the point lies inside. An even number of times it lies outside. What is true for the simple curve and its brotherly blobs may not be true for its more complicated cousins. A curve that crosses itself once behaves differently, and no matter how hard it tries, it cannot become a simple curve. This is just a taste of topology, just as 2 plus 3 is part of arithmetic, and bisecting an angle is a part of geometry. So, problems of inside and outside are a part of topology. When we think of symmetry, we usually think of a design balanced around a center line, or a folded ink blot, or a piece of architecture. We think of man as being symmetrical, yet he is only symmetrical the way some designs are. That is, he looks the same as his mirror image. There are many kinds of symmetry, and some things can be shown to be more symmetrical than others. One way to test for degrees of symmetry is to count the number of positions an object can take in a box that fits it perfectly. A man can fit in a man box only one way, but a card can fit in a card box 4 ways: front out, front upside down, back out, back upside down. A solid with 4 equilateral triangles as faces, a tetrahedron, can fit in its box with any of its 4 faces up, and with each face up, it can turn in 3 positions. 3 times 4 equal 12 positions. A cube has 6 faces, and each when up can take 4 different positions. It fits in its box 24 ways. A dodecahedron will fit in its box 60 ways. The number of ways suggests the degree of symmetry. Some things can take an infinite number of positions in their box. A cone is an example. If we put it in a cone box and mark a point, then move it halfway around, then half the distance to the starting point, then half again and again, we can keep halving forever, and the cone can take an infinite number of positions. The sphere is the most symmetrical of all. It can rotate into an infinite number of positions in an infinite number of ways. But trust the mathematician. He has a more precise way of measuring symmetry, a form of algebra called group structure. Still, fitting things in boxes is one way to gauge how much more symmetrical one thing is than another. There are many times when invisible connections link things together. When the variation of one thing determines the variation of another, then that connection is called a function. The size of the balloon is determined by the amount of air. The more air, the larger the balloon. The size, then, is a function of the amount of air. The height of a candle is such a direct function of time that the ancients measured the hours in this way. In 1 hour, the candle is 1 unit shorter. In 2 hours, 2 units. In 3 hours, 3, and so forth. The candle gets shorter with time. The boy gets taller with time. His height is a function of time because it has a definite value at any instant. Your proper weight is a function of your height, and the number to which the needle points is a function of your weight. Your weight is a function of gravity. The less gravity, as on the moon, the less weight. The speed of the locomotive is a function of the heat in the firebox, the position of the throttle, the diameter of the wheels, the grade of the track, and the direction and the velocity of the wind. It is not likely to depend on the beauty of the scenery or the color of the engineer's hair. Many laws of nature are statements of functional relationships. Functions are the beginning, and sometimes they are the goal of science. This is an old story, but it reminds us of the surprises we can get when even a small number like 2 is multiplied by itself many times. King Shahram of India was so pleased when his Grand Vizier Sisabendar presented him with a game of chess that he asked Bendar to name his own reward. The request was so modest that the happy king immediately complied. What the Grand Vizier had asked was this: that 1 grain of wheat be placed on the first square of the chessboard, 2 grains on the second square, 4 on the third, 8 on the fourth, 16 on the fifth square, and so on, doubling the amount of wheat on each succeeding square until all 64 squares were accounted for. When the king's steward had gotten to the 17th square, the table was well filled. By the 26th square, the chamber held considerable wheat, and a nervous king ordered the steward to speed up the count. When 42 squares were accounted for, the palace itself was swamped. Now fit to be tied, King Shahram learns from the court mathematician that had the process continued, the wheat required would have covered all India to a depth. Laying this many grains of wheat end to end also does something rather spectacular. They would stretch from the earth, beyond the sun, past the orbits of the planets, far out across the galaxy to the star Alpha Centauri, 4 light years away. They would then stretch back to Earth, back to Alpha Centauri, and back to the Earth again.
How about that? All right. Where am I? I'm invisible. Wow, fascinating. Not the peep show that most of you were anticipating, but little short films, little peeps into mathematical concepts and a little bit of history, etc. Yeah. Pretty exciting. Thank you for tuning in today. Very much appreciate your eyeballs and your time and your comments. If you like what you saw, you can donate via the super thanks button. Jeremy did that. Thank you, Jeremy. You can also just hit the thumbs up button, the like button. Those are ways that say that, hey, this channel is kind of interesting to me. Not everything they show is good, but in general, I like it. I like what Skip's doing. You can also buy us coffee at ko-fi.com/avgeeks or patreon.com/avgeeks. Either of those are ways to say thank you and to support us. So, thanks again. We will be back tomorrow. What was that, Thursday? Yes. And we'll watch some more films. All right, everybody take care. And see you tomorrow. Bye.